Hello and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief, and today on the channel, I've got Dr. William Lane Craig back with me to answer your questions. Any question that you have about him, his work, his ministry, we're taking those questions today, and we're not going to actually waste a whole lot of time here. If you don't know who Dr. Craig is, he's got 2 PhDs, one in philosophy, one in theology, and he also runs a website, reasonablefaith.org, which is linked in the description of this video. And so that's pretty much it. Unless, Dr. Craig, you'd like to offer anything else as by way of introduction.
I only want to say that I've enjoyed so much the podcasts that we've done together, and so I'm delighted to have this opportunity today.
Amen. All right, well, let's get to it. So we have a bunch of questions that have been sent in already, so let's get to them. And the first one, it looks like, is from Jannard, and Jannard has a $5 super chat. He says, how do you answer David Bentley Hart's objection that the doctrine of eternal conscious torment is morally unjustifiable?
I think that we should not understand hell in terms of punishment for the array of finite sins that we commit in this lifetime. Sins like murder and theft and adultery, even terrorism and mass murder, surely merit finite amounts of punishment, not infinite punishment. But I think that the sin of rejecting God is a sort of meta sin of an entirely different order, because this sin separates us from God decisively, and because of the dignity of God's person, is a sin of infinite gravity and proportion, and therefore deserves infinite punishment.
Okay, so unfortunately, it looks like, well, this is good and bad, I suppose, but we had a bunch of people send in super chats. Thank you, by the way, for doing this. And they sent them in before the stream started, which means it doesn't look like it pulled up in my software that I'm using. So unfortunately, I can't put these on the screen. But here's a question from WMS Religion. Let me go ahead and hide this one that we just answered. WMS Religion says, if Jesus' references Old Testament characters such as Adam and Noah as historical, is he also affirming the details of the events associated with each Old Testament character? How do we interpret parallel acts in ancient Near Eastern cultures?
This is a huge question that I deal with in one of the chapters in my forthcoming book on the historical Adam. And I think that it's important to differentiate between an illustrative view of an Old Testament figure and what I would call an assertoric view of one of these figures. I think that Jesus' references to Adam and the original couple and their marriage is a reference to the literary figure in the Genesis story, and therefore does not carry with it a commitment to historicity. I think that's far too simplistic. Just as I could say, as Robinson Crusoe had his man, Friday, to help him, so I have my teaching assistant at Talbot School of Theology to help me. And that comparison would be perfectly legitimate and would not require that I'm committed to the reality of Robinson Crusoe or Friday. And in fact, you find quite a number of references in the New Testament to figures in Jewish apocryphal literature and folklore that I don't think we want to be committed to historically. People like Janus and Jambres, the magicians, which Jewish folklore named in the court of Pharaoh in Egypt who opposed Moses. Paul refers to them in his letters to Timothy. So I think we have to say that sometimes these references, not only to the Old Testament, but also to Jewish apocrypha and folklore, are merely for illustrative purposes, and therefore it's far too simplistic to infer from such references the historicity of the figures involved.
Okay, we're going to move through these questions as quick as we can because we have so many that have been sent in. This is really, really cool. Anthony Rowden asked, Dr. Craig, thanks for your work. Can you explain your response to the grounding objection and how you ground the truth makers of such counterfactual statements prior to God's creative decree.
Well, what I do is challenge the whole truth maker theory. I think it's important to understand that the idea that every truth has a truth maker is not entailed by the view of truth as correspondence with reality. It's in fact a position held by a minority of philosophers today. And the doctrine of what's called truth maker maximalism, namely that every truth has a truth maker, is hardly held to by anybody today. It's generally recognized that there are propositions which are true that have no truth makers. For example, Baal does not exist. There's no truth maker of that proposition, and yet it's clearly true. Trenton Merrick's, in his book on truth, gives a whole retinue of these sorts of propositions which are true but plausibly have no truth makers. And I would say that counterfactual propositions, which concern things that don't even exist, would be prime candidates for that kind of proposition. So Alvin Plantinga has said that I am far more confident that some counterfactuals are true than I am of truth maker maximalism. And I would agree wholeheartedly with Plantinga in that score.
So an interesting paper came out recently. I don't know if it's published yet, by a young philosopher by the name of Justin Mooney. He has a new paper out where he argues that we can have an account of how God knows these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which is interesting, I think, development. Well, let's move on to another question from Hunter. He says, in sleep, we create detailed dream worlds, insert ourselves into them via an avatar, and hide from ourselves what's around the next corner. Sounds analogous to the Incarnation. If so, is that intentional, in some sense revealing or significant?
I don't know if it's intentional, but I do think that it is significant. In his book, The Logic of God Incarnate, Thomas Morris appeals to dream worlds as one illustration of how you can have a kind of sub-mind within a broader encompassing mind. The dreamer is the broader encompassing mind, and you in your dream is the sub-mind. And the encompassing mind is aware of what's happening to the dreamer, and the dreamer may or may not be aware of the encompassing mind. You know, there are sometimes in dreams where you are actually aware that you're dreaming. And you want to wake up, and maybe you can't, and it makes it nightmarish. But you're actually aware that you are dreaming, that there is a broader encompassing mind. And this provides, I think, a useful analogy to the Incarnation. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is an encompassing mind which can include within itself the conscious life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so there can be things of which Jesus of Nazareth is ignorant and unaware, like the date of his second coming, even though this is known to the Logos.
All right, another question from Gina M. She says, Dr. Craig, what are your thoughts on other versions of the Kalam cosmological argument? For example, Andrew Locke's. Why do you prefer your particular formulation?
Boy, I'm embarrassed to say that I cannot recite from memory Andrew's version of the argument. I'm happy with my version, and so I haven't cared to pursue other versions. The only modifications I have made would be to offer a more modest version of the first premise. Instead of saying whatever begins to exist has a cause, you can say more modestly, if the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. And that is, I think, even more obvious than that universal premise. But apart from that, I just haven't seen any reason to pursue other formulations of the argument. The one I offer is the original one from Al-Ghazali. It's simple, easy to understand, easily memorizable, deductively valid, and so I just don't see any reason to move away from it.
Okay, next question from Cranman Photo Cinema. He's our videographer. I like to always say that. He's great, and you should look him up. What is the difference between physical time and metaphysical time? And wouldn't the Trinity be subject to time while in a loving relationship with each other prior to creation?
Okay, great question. Metaphysical time would be time that is not dependent upon physical clocks. It would exist and pass independent of any physical realities or mechanisms. It's what Isaac Newton called absolute time. And Newton believed that absolute time flows necessarily independent of any physical processes whatsoever. And I think that we have a kind of knockdown argument for the difference between metaphysical and physical time in the thought experiment of God counting down to the moment of creation. If we imagine God counting down, 3, 2, 1, let there be light, then there wouldn't be any physical time prior to the end of the countdown, but those mental events of counting down would be sequentially ordered in time. And so there would be a kind of metaphysical time prior to the physical time that begins at the Big Bang. Now, I think that the doctrine of the Trinity actually provides a wonderful illustration of how God can be personal and yet exist timelessly. The Greek church fathers had a doctrine called perichoresis. And the doctrine of perichoresis is that the three persons of the Trinity are completely transparent to each other. What the Father loves, the Son and the Spirit love. What the Son knows, the Father and the Spirit know. What the Spirit wills, the Father and the Son will. They all have the same knowledge, will, and love unchangingly. It can never change because they are perfect and complete. And so it seems to me that they would exist in this perfect, timeless love relationship of knowledge, will, and love together. And it would be just like two lovers who sit staring into each other's eyes, and we say they were lost in that timeless moment. Well, that is literally how I think it would be for God existing in this perichoretic relationship of the Trinity without the creation.
I had my mic muted. Here we go. All right, so let's move on really quickly to the next super chat from Arista. I'm not even going to try this one. Well, at least we're back on with being able to put these on the screen. So here we go. Question is, how does God know my future? It's present to him or he foreknows it. In the first case, B theory is correct. Future exists objectively. In the second, A theory works, but future will be determined by God's initial conditions.
This was the subject of my work on divine foreknowledge and human freedom. And I argue that God has literal foreknowledge of the future. God exists presently, and he knows what will happen. And I would deny that in any way implies that the future is necessary or fixed or non-contingent or cannot fail to happen. I think all of the arguments from God's foreknowledge to the necessity of the future are fallacious, either being logically invalid or involving a false premise. And if you're interested in pursuing this, take a look at my little book, The Only Wise God, which explores this issue in detail.
Okay, next question from Daniel Lightsey, and we're getting through a lot of these really quickly, so that's great. So here it is. Do you have any recommendations on which graduate schools to apply for, or any advice for deciding where to go for graduate school for philosophy?
I really recommend Talbot School of Theology to get your MA in philosophy. I think that there is great advantage as a Christian to having an MA degree in philosophy from a theological institution. It enables you to get, along with your philosophical training, your Greek for reading the New Testament, and to take elective courses in systematic theology and biblical studies. And so I have found my theological education to be just invaluable to me as a Christian philosopher. And what you can then do is go on from Talbot to pursue your terminal degree, your PhD degree, at the finest secular institution, so that you will have a degree that will be universally respected by possible employers. Now, if you don't want to take that advice, there are other institutions where you can get a good degree in philosophy from a Christian perspective, such as Baylor University, which has a very strong department in philosophy, some good Christian thinkers there. And,
Alexander Pruss.
Yes, he is there. Frank Beckwith, Trent Dougherty, several others. And this would be another school that I would recommend.
Okay, here's another super chat from how did you pronounce this?
Aristarchus.
Aristarchus.
Famous philosopher.
I'm not up to speed. I should be. Assuming the universe has an immaterial cause, you consider a mind to be the only candidate. Why not something not intelligent which causes its effects randomly? Can you object without using the fine-tuning argument?
Yes, I can't make any sense of what that is. I mean, you've not given me what that candidate is. It seems to me that the only thing that would fit the description of a timeless, spaceless, immaterial object would be either an abstract object or a mind. I can't think of anything else. And an abstract object doesn't stand in causal relations. So it follows from that argument that the cause of the universe is an unembodied mind or consciousness, and therefore a person. So you've got to give me an alternative if you're going to refute this argument.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out in your work is that if you have a sort of indeterministic, non-personal cause, there's not really a whole lot of reason to think that the universe would just begin, or our space-time would begin 13.7 or 8 billion years ago.
You know, that's right. I didn't think of that in answer to this question, but you're right. Causing effects randomly would make you have to answer the question, then why did it originate just 13.7 billion years ago rather than the day before or any time in the past? If it's truly operating randomly, the universe at any point should have existed already for infinite time. But if you have a free agent endowed with free will, then he can arbitrarily choose when to start the universe without any antecedent determining conditions. It's not random.
Here's another question from Adam Bamford. He says, what is the funniest thing that has happened during one of your debates? Something that someone said or something that happened which made you laugh?
Well,
that's a good question.
Yes, and I'm not sure. I'll say, here's one story that really was something. I debated the very famous atheist philosopher Antony Flew at Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin. And he was very nervous about this debate. We had dinner together as a group, and he kept muttering that my wife told me I should never have gotten involved in this thing, and he was really uptight. Well, when the debate started, his microphone didn't work at his podium, and people in the audience were yelling out to him, "Can't hear you! Microphone!" And it was like catcalls to him, and he got so upset that he began to stomp around on the stage and say, well, if this thing isn't going to work, we might as well call the whole thing off. And I was honestly afraid he was going to stomp off the stage and the whole debate would be scuttled. Well, fortunately, the technicians gave him my microphone from my podium, and he was able to continue. But it was really a very hairy moment for a while.
Wow. That's an incredible story. All right, Jeff Singer says, if moral law is absolute, can we know God's law with absolute certainty, since once it leaves his mind, it's no longer in its perfect form? With even a picogram of interpretation, is it still absolute?
It's so important to understand that the moral argument that I give for God's existence has nothing to do with moral epistemology. It's all about moral ontology. Are there objective moral values and duties? So the question of whether or not we have absolute certainty about moral values and duties, or whether or not we have more uncertain knowledge, is just not of much interest or moment to me. I guess I would say, on the basis of moral experience, that we really do have virtual certainty about some moral values and duties. For example, that it would be wrong to torture and rape a little child for fun. I think I know that as certainly as I know anything. Michael Roos, who's an atheist, has said that the man who says that the man who says that it's morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Now that puts that moral truth on the same level as the truths of elementary arithmetic. So I do think we do have a very, very high degree of certainty with regard to at least some moral values and duties.
All right, another question from Andy Gregory. And by the way, I should say thank you for all of these super chats. Every single one has been sent in this way. Could you touch on the brute fact versus brute contingency issue that came up in the math debate with Oppie? Many saw that as the deciding point.
Did they? Well, this is dealt with in a question of the week that I've already written and should be forthcoming in the next couple of weeks on our website. Now, what Graham says is that the applicability of mathematics to the physical world is brute. That is to say, there's no explanation for it, but it's not contingent. It's metaphysically necessary. My position is that it's contingent, but it's not brute. That is to say, there is an explanation for why the mathematical description that characterizes the laws of nature applies, namely that it was put in place by a transcendent mathematical mind who chose to create a universe on that model. Now, as I say, on my view, it's contingent which laws of nature obtain. And this is the view of everybody else that I know of, except for Graham. That's why I was so astonished to hear him say this. Who thinks that the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary descriptions of reality? Couldn't we have lived in a universe that was describable by Newtonian physics rather than quantum physics or relativistic physics? That's what everybody thought for 300 years. So why is that impossible? He's taking here a line that is so radical that it makes theism look modest by comparison.
Okay, another question from Gina M. She says, what do you see as the future of dialogue between atheists and Christians, and what are the biggest intellectual sticking points you most often see preventing Christian belief?
I do think that the dialogue will continue, and this is because more and more Christians are going into the field of philosophy, and this transforms the face of this discipline. I once heard Alvin Plantinga say that he thinks that probably there are 50% more Christian graduate students in philosophy than Christian faculty in philosophy. 50% more in the pipes coming up through the system. And that bodes very well then for the future when these young men and women eventually do assume faculty positions. And so I think the dialogue is definitely going to continue. I guess the greatest obstacle to dialogue would probably just be apathy. It's very easy for these non-believing philosophers to ignore the work of Christian philosophers. I have been really astonished by stories that students have told me who attend secular universities and take introductory courses in philosophy where they discuss things like religious epistemology and arguments for the existence of God, and they never read or discuss in the class the work of Alvin Plantinga or Richard Swinburne or Robert Adams or William Alston. it's as though the faculty are just pulling the wool over the eyes of these students. So I think that's the biggest inhibitor to dialogue, is this apathy and refusal to engage with the work of Christian thinkers.
Okay, question from Maverick Christian. He says, what advice would you give philosophy students wanting to get published in peer-reviewed literature? I've gotten one of my papers accepted via an eternal society paradox, but wouldn't mind more publications.
Well, congratulations. To already publish a paper as a student is an enormous accomplishment and is going to look good on your curriculum vitae or resume, I think. I guess I would say try to focus on a very, very specific topic. It will be much easier if you are responding to another article that's already been published in that journal and that you can discuss. That way that the focus is narrow. They want to publish things that are responses to articles already in their journal, because that keeps the dialogue going and readers coming back. So I would encourage the student to look for something to which he can write a response and to make his response very narrow and specific. And that will increase the chances of getting it published. I'd also say keep it short. Don't be wordy or lengthy. Make it pithy and concise.
All right, question from Gurgly Nagy. I think that's his name. All right. What will be the future of the Christian philosophy? Issues, trends, influence. God bless you.
I think that the Christian revolution in philosophy is going to continue. I just mentioned the number of graduate students who are Christians coming up through the pipes. That gives me great encouragement that even though a man like Alvin Plantinga is irreplaceable by any single philosopher, he may be replaced by dozens of other philosophers who will come onto the scene. I also think that this Renaissance is going to continue to grow in Europe. I'm very encouraged by the young German philosophers of religion in Germany and Austria who are doing very good work. And that's tremendously encouraging. There, the fires are just tiny glimmers, but they are burning, and I believe they're going to grow. So I'm an optimist about what the future holds for Christian philosophy.
Okay, question from Max Houghton. What reasons can one give that Mark 15:43 through 47, the burial account, was in the pre-Markan source? In a survey by M.L. Swords with 34 scholars, 14 thought that at least part of 1543 was in the original.
Yes, I think that it's, maybe I'd better, before I answer this question, find out what 43 to 47 is, because I don't know from memory exactly the content of those verses. But certainly Joseph of Arimathea is widely regarded as the historical person that buried Jesus. He's not what you would expect from a burial account. You would expect a Christian legend to have Jesus' family or his disciples be responsible for Jesus' burial. And in fact, in the Pieta statues, that's what you have, Mary cradling the corpse of her dead son, which is what you would expect from pious Christian legend. But it's not what you have in the Gospels. Instead, you have a Sanhedrist, all of whom, Mark says, voted to condemn Jesus, who gives Jesus a proper burial in a tomb. And so that's one of the most important considerations. It's also multiply attested in various sources that Jesus was buried in the tomb, and so enjoys that ratification as well. There are also other indications that it's a very early story. For example, Mark's use of the phrase "on the first day of the week," instead of using the expression "on the third day," which is very common in the New Testament, later Christian kerygma. That shows the primitiveness of Mark's tradition. because he's using a phrase here that's very awkward in Greek, but it's natural in Aramaic, the original language spoken by the disciples. So I think there are very good grounds for accepting the historicity of the burial by Joseph. And I lay these out in my books on the resurrection of Jesus, for example, the chapter in Reasonable Faith.
Okay, another question from Edictos a la Philosophia. I'm awful. All right, what are the best two arguments for A theory of time and the best two against the B theory? Why don't we just do one? Because I think that might be too much. Also, completely unrelated, what do you think of Hegel?
Well, let me say to the second one, I don't think of Hegel very much at all. So I'll just ignore that one. With the A theory, I think there are two arguments for the A theory of time that predominate. One is from the presentness of experience. In experience, I grasp the presentness of my own experience. And any attempt to eliminate that is going to involve an affirmation of that very presentness. The presentness of experience is even more firmly ratified to us than the experience of the external world. Because the external world, that experience could be illusory, but the experience of presentness cannot, because even the illusion of presentness is present to you. So the presentness of our experience is even more warranted than belief in the external world. The second argument would be the ineliminability of tense from language. We know that there are tensed truths, and these tensed truths are ineliminable. You cannot translate them into tenseless truths without a loss of meaning. And I think that gives good grounds for thinking that therefore reality is tensed. Corresponding to these tensed truths are tensed facts about the way the world is. Now, against the B theory, besides the arguments for the A theory, I guess I would say with respect to the B theory that it involves a view of persons that is really objectionable, namely that persons are not self-conscious, three-dimensional beings that endure through time, but they are four-dimensional extended space-time entities that are not, in fact, self-conscious and do not make decisions. And that just makes nonsense of what it is to be a person. In my book, Time and Eternity, I give other arguments against the B theory of time as well, including that there are no good reasons for it. And so I would refer the listener to that book.
Okay, question from Eric Hernandez, whom you may know. He says on Calvinism, if God's, and he says CFK, and I need some help here. CFK, if God's, it looks like he's saying if God's knowledge of creature of free
counterfactual knowledge, I don't know.
Yeah, if God's knowledge of creaturely freedom maybe is based after and solely on his decree, would this imply that the Molinist view of God has more items of knowledge, and or that the Calvinist view of God is not omniscient prior to the decree?
I think that Calvinists would generally deny that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, of libertarian freedom. And therefore, that would be true that the Molinist deity is more knowledgeable than the Calvinistic deity, because he knows an infinite number of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that are not known to the God of Calvinism. Now, I do think the Calvinist can make his view reconcilable with middle knowledge, though I don't know of anybody who's ever tried to do this. What the Calvinist could say is, yes, God does have middle knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and as he looks at the worlds that are feasible for him based upon his knowledge of counterfactuals, he sees that all of these are horrible worlds. They're awful. And therefore, he prefers a world in which he himself determines everything that happens over any world that has free creatures in it. And so even though God has this counterfactual knowledge of feasible worlds involving human freedom, he freely chooses not to create any of them and unilaterally determines everything. I think the reason no Calvinist adopts that view is because he would think that still compromises God's sovereignty, that there are feasible worlds that God could have made in which God doesn't or wouldn't determine everything.
All right, a question from Ferenc. Should the B or any other atemporal theory of time proven to be correct, how would you modify the Kalam if you wouldn't discard it completely?
Well, I would give up the second philosophical argument based upon the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition. And I would have to redefend the causal premise in such a way that it doesn't appeal to something's coming into being without a cause, but rather just say that something can't begin to exist without a cause. The scientific evidence for the finitude of the past would still go in place. So even though the abandonment of an A theory of time would damage the argument and cause you to reformulate some of its support, it wouldn't be fatal.
Okay, here we go. Question from Adictos a la Filosofia. There we go. Maybe that was right. Some say the idea of creation out of nothing violates the principle out of nothing, nothing comes. To me, it's a confusion, but could you give your thoughts?
I think Adictos is absolutely correct about this. When classical theologians affirm the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, they mean that God created the universe without any material cause. God is the efficient cause of the universe, but there is no material cause of the universe, to borrow those Aristotelian categories. But ex nihilo, nihil fit, is the premise that nothing can come into being without a cause. There has to be a cause of some sort in order for something to come into being. So in creatio ex nihilo, you most certainly do have a cause, namely God. He is the efficient cause of what comes into being, and so that doesn't violate the principle that out of nothing, nothing comes.
Question from Mike. Thank you for your super chat. He says, is it likely that anyone is transworld depraved, apt to reject God no matter what circumstances he places them in, especially since he loves all equally?
I don't think that the love of God would have anything to do with it. God loves the damned, I think. I'm not a Calvinist. I think that God loves those who reject him, and it breaks his heart that some people separate themselves from him irrevocably. So whether or not there are people who are transworldly damned, that is to say, or depraved, that is to say, people who would sin in any feasible world in which God would create them, your guess is as good as mine. I don't think we have access to that kind of knowledge.
Okay, question from Joshua Anderson. He says, love Dr. Craig and his work. What are his thoughts on most archaeologists believing polytheism was before monotheism and that very early humans did not practice religion?
I have not studied this. I know that there are paleoanthropologists who believe that monotheism was primitive and that polytheism developed either later or independently, but I've never studied it myself. That sort of historical question just isn't of much interest to me philosophically, because to try to invalidate a view by showing how it originated commits the genetic fallacy. And so regardless of how it originated, the truth of monotheism is quite independent of its historical origins.
All right, question from Cody Payne. He says, how do you feel about apologist arguments like Michael Jones's that take from interpretations of quantum mechanics the fact that information and possibility are fundamental and thus grounded in the mind of God?
I'm not familiar with Michael Jones' argument, and so I really can't comment. It does sound a little bit like the argument from the applicability of mathematics that I have championed, and so I would simply have to learn more.
All right, question from Jimmy Price. He says, critics often point out that the New Testament scholars have a pre-existing theological commitment to the text. How important are presuppositions in establishing the best explanation of the minimal facts?
I think that this fellow, not Jimmy, but the critics, have a very naive view of New Testament studies. Up through the time of Bultmann, the 1940s, New Testament scholarship was overwhelmingly hostile to the historicity of the Gospels. Some theologians like Bruno Bauer denied that there ever was a historical Jesus. Scholars thought that Jesus was the product of years of legend and mythological accretion. Bultmann believed that all that you could know about the historical Jesus could be written on a 4x6 index card. Now, these are the biblical theologians that are saying this. And what's happened is that there has been a tremendous revolution in the second half of the 20th century with regard to historical Jesus scholars. This revolution has been called by some the reclamation of the Jewishness of Jesus. And what they mean by that is that it came to be realized by New Testament scholars that the proper background for understanding Jesus of Nazareth was not pagan mythology, but rather first century Palestinian Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. The disciples were all Jews. And if we're to understand the Gospels in their historical context, it's against that background that they must be interpreted. And when they are so interpreted, the Gospels emerge as very credible sources for the life and ministry of the historical Jesus. And so it has been, in spite of their predispositions to the contrary, that New Testament scholarship has come to appreciate the historical credibility of the Gospels, and that includes facts like the burial of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. So it is just simply naive to try to write off the good work of contemporary New Testament critics on the historical Jesus as due to bias or theological presuppositions.
All right, before we get to the next question, which is actually a really good one, I want to briefly mention that if you're enjoying the content that we're doing here, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. That's a way that you can help out this ministry. And if you want to help us out a little bit more, go over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity and subscribe for $5, $10 a month, however much you'd like. What we're doing right now is we're in the process of starting to host conferences, apologetics conferences, all across the country. We're starting in Houston, and our first one is slotted to start in the fall of 2021, assuming that COVID and everything is going to be done by then. So this is what we're planning on doing, and the way that we're making this happen is we're looking to bring my wife Brittany on board full-time with this ministry. And so we're already at this point, we're about 32% of the way there, the funds that we need to raise in order to bring her on full-time, in addition to planning events and conferences and all that good stuff. She's also going to be the point of contact for our patrons, for our supporters, so that if you have a question, if you need anything, she'll be there right there and answer any question that you have. So if you'd like to support this ministry, please do so, patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Support the conferences that we're going to start doing and everything, and it's just a super, super exciting time. So let's get back to questions. This one is from a supporter who signed up recently, and it's interesting. His name is Will Craig, if you can believe it. He said, early in my walk with Christ, I accidentally discovered apologetics by Googling my name out of curiosity. He even has the L too, but not the lane. He says, Dr. Craig's work revolutionized my faith. Thank you.
Praise the Lord. Well, that's fantastic.
So funny. JMD Apologetics 101, he says, how does the Trinity relate to God's timelessness before God creates the universe? Also, thank you, Dr. Craig, for your work. Has changed my life.
Sure. I'll just refer back to my answer earlier in this podcast to the doctrine of perichoresis and the relations of the members of the Trinity sans creation.
All right, from James Kane, he says, is the gospel presentation using the four spiritual laws developed by Bill Bright in the 1950s still as relevant? For 2020, would a King Jesus gospel presentation be better? For example, N.T. Wright.
I don't know N.T. Wright's King Jesus Gospel presentation, so I can't speak to it. I was trained in using the four spiritual laws. I do know that some younger folks kind of reject the idea of spiritual laws. I think to them this sounds too legalistic. The four spiritual laws begins just as there are natural laws that govern the physical universe, so there are spiritual laws that govern your relationship with God. I think that has a great appeal to a scientifically minded person who understands natural law, but I guess it doesn't appeal to some people. So, Campus Crusade for Christ revised the four spiritual laws and put out a different version called Knowing God Personally. And this is a much more relational version of the four laws that talks about how you were created to have a personal relationship with God. And so one might want to use that instead of the original four-law booklet.
All right, we have a very interesting question from I. Chaben, it looks like. In heaven there is no evil. In heaven good exists in the absence of evil. So why couldn't God create the world with no evil? Thanks.
I think that it's possible that the reason there is no evil in heaven is because the freedom to sin has been removed. I think that God has created us in this world to go through a sort of veil of decision making, during which we are at something of an arm's length from God. God's existence is obscured, and this permits us to have the freedom to reject him or to follow him. But when we go to heaven, then I think we will see Christ in all his glory and all his beauty. And that vision of God will be so overwhelming that it will effectively remove the freedom to sin. I like to compare it to a huge electromagnet with iron filings in its present. The iron filings would be immediately attracted to stick to the electromagnet, and they couldn't possibly fall away because of its overwhelming force. And so God, I think, has given us this opportunity in this lifetime to freely choose where we want to spend eternity. But once we do make that choice and go to heaven, then the freedom to sin will be removed by what medievals called the beatific vision of God.
Yeah, I'm drawn to that view as well. I also like the point that you made about if you start everyone out in heaven, you basically don't give anybody the opportunity to choose to be in heaven. I think that's a really great good. Another thing that I like to point out is Alvin Plantinga's defense of supralapsarianism, which is basically the view that, that what Jesus did on the cross is one of the greatest goods that can obtain in any possible world, and you can't have that without a world that has both earth and heaven, so to speak. And then another one that I like to point out, I did a video on this, that's the only reason why I'm even adding anything here. But another one that I like to point out is that love manifesting virtues, and you can think of a virtue like forgiveness or courage or sacrifice, those goods are not possible without suffering. And so basically, if you start everyone out in heaven, you don't get all of these other great goods, like the good of the cross, the good of being able to let people choose to come into heaven, and the good of these love manifesting virtues. You can't have all of this really good stuff that also requires suffering. So, yeah. All right, let's move on to another question, expanding truth. Is it possible disciples made up the resurrection?
No, that's the old conspiracy theory of 17th, 18th century deism, which no one would defend today. In my books like Reasonable Faith and On Guard, I give reasons why this is universally rejected today. So you needn't be worried about that possibility.
Okay, Michael Rathbone says, how does quantum entanglement relate to the debate between A theory and B theory of time? Does it entail an objective present?
Okay, let's explain this a little bit. There's an experiment that Einstein developed, a thought experiment, that is to say, to try to show that there are relations of absolute simultaneity in the world, and to eliminate quantum indeterminacy. And what he imagined was two photons originating in a certain place, but fired in opposite directions. So they're moving at the speed of light, away from each other. Now, if you perform a measurement on one photon, the other one immediately takes on the correlated value. That's required by quantum mechanics. And yet there's no causal influence that could go from the measured one to the other one. So how is this possible? Well, it would seem to require that there be relations of absolute simultaneity in the world, which would, I think, support a view of relativity theory that would be consistent with an A theory of time, so that one wouldn't need to adopt this kind of B theory of time. You could have what's called a Lorentzian theory of relativity that involves relations of absolute simultaneity, and you can add to that then relations of absolute becoming and presentness to get an A theory of time. So I think that this EPR experiment and the results that have been done on it, Bell's theorem, fully confirmed the predictions of quantum mechanics, goes to support a Lorentzian view of relativity and hence lends credibility to an A theory of time.
Okay, question from Robert Nass Worthington. He says, what is your opinion of the fourfold gospel hypothesis popularized by David Allen Black? This is the theory that disagrees with Markan priority based on patristic evidence.
I'm not familiar with it, and so I really cannot comment.
All right, from Vinay Rege. He says, why did God create hard rules to follow? For example, sex rules.
That's a good question, because it can be hard, can't it, to live a celibate and pure life as a single young man, and yet this is what God requires of us. And I think it's simply because God knows what is conducive to human flourishing. When he created Adam and Eve, he did so in a monogamous heterosexual marriage relationship, and I think he knew that that is the secure and safe place for human sexuality to be expressed. And so even though it's hard, I think I'd encourage young men to stick with the biblical ethics, and I am very confident that you will be glad that you did. It will save you a lot of heartache, a lot of emotional scars if you do.
I don't want to sound too patronizing, but to give an analogy, my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, would probably like to eat candy all day long. And she might ask the question, why do you make these difficult rules? Why can't I just eat candy all the time? And it's because there's a good reason not to eat candy. It's going to make you sick. It's going to be bad for you. It's going to hurt your flourishing. All right. Amir El Shafra says, why do you reject reading Genesis in its ancient Near Eastern context for an anachronistic reading of it?
Oh, why does he say that? My whole approach to the historical Adam is that we read Genesis 1 to 11 against the cultural backdrop of ancient Near Eastern, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian mythology. So Amir is just completely misinformed about the approach that I take to the interpretation of Genesis.
Here's a question, and it's sort of related to something we've already talked about. So if you don't want to add anything to it, that's fine. Nate asked, if the eighth theory of time is false, does the Kalam cosmological argument still work?
Yes, I did answer that, and I think that while it would require revision, it still goes through.
Cranman Photocinema again. He says, what is the difference between physical time and metaphysical time? Oh, I think he already, it looks like we've already answered this one.
Okay.
Yep, the Trinity and yep. All right, so Brandon says, in Romans, it talks about man being without excuse for not knowing God. What should man know from general revelation? Is special revelation necessary?
Well, Paul seems to suggest that from general revelation alone, that is to say, God's revelation in nature, that all persons are responsible for knowing that God's eternal deity and power are present, so that there is a powerful creator of the natural realm. And then in Romans 2, he says that the moral law of God is written on men's hearts, so that even without the law, they have an instinctual grasp of the moral requirements that God puts upon them. So it would seem that from general revelation alone, all persons are responsible for believing that there is a creator God and moral lawgiver to whom we are responsible and whose forgiveness we need. Now, is special revelation necessary? Necessary for what is the question. It's disputed among theologians whether or not a person can come to salvation through general revelation alone. We do have examples in the Old Testament of what are sometimes called holy pagans of the Old Testament. People like Melchizedek and Job, who were not even part of the Old Testament covenant family of Israel, and yet who certainly knew God. And so it may be possible for someone to come to know God through his response to general revelation alone. That is to say, he looks out at the world and senses that all of this has been made by God. He senses the demands of God's moral law in his heart. He realizes his utter inability to fulfill the demands of God's moral law, and so he flings himself upon the mercy of this unknown God. And it's possible, I think, that someone might come to salvation in that way. I hope we see Aristotle in heaven.
That'd be kind of cool.
And so I think it might be possible.
Okay, from a question from Gilgan Dilgit. What is the most understudied area of Christian apologetics? Uh-oh.
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
I don't know. I do think that too often Christian apologists skip the theistic arguments and go too quickly to Christian evidences, like the historical credibility of the Gospels or the resurrection of Jesus. And I do think it's important that the Christian apologist have a good case for theism to make.
Fair enough. Another question from Craig Reeves. He says, what would be your response to the heaven objection to the free will defense? And this is something we already talked about as well. So
yes, I think I've already answered that.
Okay, from JMD Apologetics again, he says, I would love to have you on my channel, Dr. Craig, but I understand that you're busy. I'm a young apologist who has been highly influenced by you.
Well, how does he know that I'm too busy unless he asks? I'd say submit a proposal to our website and we'll see if something can be scheduled.
Okay, there you go, JMD. All right, Giulio Mushi says, Dr. Craig, would you shed more light on Suarez's Congruism? According to Congruism, is God's predestination prior to his middle knowledge?
Yes, that's a good way of thinking of it. On Congruism, it's a form of Molinism that comes as close to Calvinism as you can possibly get. There's not even a hair's breadth between them. What Suarez said is that God picks which people he wants to be saved and which ones he wants to be damned. And then via his middle knowledge, he gives to the elect gifts of grace to which he knows they would freely respond and be saved. And he does not give those sorts of gifts to those who he wants to be damned, and so they are lost. And so on this view, God determines unilaterally who will be saved and who will be lost. And yet, it is compatible with libertarian free will. And in that sense, it's not Calvinism, but boy, it comes about as close to Calvinism as you can get. And this was not Molina's view, I just want to say.
Okay, question from Brenda. I recently heard a Christian philosopher say in a debate that he believes that there could be suffering in heaven. What do you think?
I have a hard time thinking that that would be true. You know, the descriptions of heaven that we get are of a place where God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and it will be a place of glory and praise to God and worship of the King. I find it hard to think that there would be suffering there, and certainly I don't see any reason to think there would be suffering there.
Okay, question from Alex Pickney. He says, what's the difference between an inference to the best explanation, induction, and a hypothesis?
Oh, I think that a hypothesis is merely the explanation that you offer for the empirical data to be explained. So you have some empirical data, and then you construct a pool of live options, which are the different hypotheses. And then what you do is you test those hypotheses by means of certain criteria, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, degree of ad hocness, plausibility, and so forth. And on the basis of those criteria, you then determine which hypothesis best meets the criteria, and the one that does is most likely to be true and is the best explanation of the data.
Okay, question from Roshan. This one is a long one, so I'm waiting for it to populate. What is the difference or unique? What is different? Sorry, I'm reading this wrong. What is different or unique about each soul? Does God create all souls equivalent before being placed into a body? How does this work with views like transworld damnation, since God is the very being who created the soul that is transworld damned?
Well, now, don't confuse transworld damnation with the damnation of a soul. These are embodied beings in these other possible worlds, right? We're talking about people, human beings, but they're just human beings in different possible worlds. So it doesn't have anything to do with the soul. Now, in terms of the qualities of the soul, I don't know. I mean, I can only speculate. I am inclined to think, for example, that properties of masculinity and femininity would belong to souls. That a soul is not feminine just in virtue of being embodied in a female body rather than a male body. And there may be other sorts of intrinsic properties to souls in terms of intelligence, for example, or acuteness. There could even be personality traits that are independent of the body. I just don't know, but I haven't seen any reason to think that souls could not have these sorts of properties independent of the physical body.
Okay, question from What's the Takeaway? Dr. Craig, during your career, have you ever come across a positive argument for atheism? Are there any arguments against God that are successful?
Well, obviously, I don't think any are successful, or I would not be a theist. But I think there are certainly positive arguments for atheism, the problem of evil, for example, and I think the problem of the hiddenness of God is really an acute problem that can cause great doubts. God just seems so absent sometimes that it's hard to believe that he's really there.
What are your thoughts on this? And when it comes to arguments for atheism, that you mentioned the problem of evil and hiddenness, those seem to be arguments against a very specific theism. And so if you argue against that type of theism, which is the theism that as Christians we belong to, but rejecting that version of theism doesn't necessarily land you in atheism. You could accept any number of different polytheistic views of different gods that are not perfectly good.
Oh, well, now, when you talk about theism, I take that to mean that God exists. And I do think there are certain essential qualities to God, like perfect goodness. A God that was morally flawed, I would say it was God with a small g. That's not God with a capital G. So a God that was indifferent and unloving, I'm not sure that that would qualify as God. And so I think that
Fair enough.
arguments from evil and hiddenness are good arguments. Um, the argument that gave me the most trouble personally, though, was neither of those two. It was the argument from the reality of abstract objects. Um, Essential to God is the quality of being, of existing ase, divine aseity, or self-existence. God is the sole ultimate reality, the source of all things other than himself. And the challenge of Platonism to this was one that for many years I had no answer to. That is to say, it seems that there are necessarily existing and eternal abstract objects like mathematical entities, propositions, properties, possible worlds, and so forth, which are uncreated by God and exist just as necessarily and self-existently as he does. And that is a dagger in the heart of theism, because it would deny that there is a being with this central theistic property of being uniquely self-existent. And so I spent 13 years working on this problem and completed that work around 4 years ago or so, and published 2 books on it. And that was a great victory for me in terms of my own intellectual satisfaction with theism.
Well, as the time ticks on, I'm getting a little bit more sad and sad. We've only got about 20 minutes left, and we'll get as many questions as we can, I promise. And maybe we can schedule another one of these in the future. Who knows?
Sure.
From Luke Pixler, he says, Dr. Craig's moral argument helped me lead a student to Christ. How would you approach apologetics in a church student ministry? Could we cause doubt by introducing objections they aren't wrestling with?
You know, I have really worried about this, that by raising these apologetic questions, it gets people to thinking who otherwise just would be satisfied with their emotional worship experience and do just fine, so that you could actually do more harm than good by raising these issues with students. But I have come to believe, Cameron, on the basis of experience and talking to people, that people who are uninformed in that way are actually more vulnerable and more prone to doubts than people who have been informed about apologetics and so have informed doubts about their faith. Perhaps it's because the latter, being informed, know there's also abundant answers and that they haven't exhausted those, and that there are brilliant philosophers and New Testament scholars and scientists who believe, and that therefore, even though they may have these unresolved questions, they're not as destructive as are the doubts of the naive person who begins to doubt whether or not God exists or Christ is true and has no resources. And you know, recently we've seen a rash of these kinds of defections from the Christian faith on the part of worship leaders and Christian musicians who, to all appearances, just had no training in this area at all, and so who became sitting ducks for these kinds of destructive doubts. So while certainly there is that danger that you mentioned, I think that it's a risk that we must run, because the risks of not doing it, I think, are far much greater and far more destructive.
Okay, question from Stephen. He says, Dr. Craig, what are your thoughts on the growing block theory of time?
Oh, I think it's incoherent. This is a kind of marriage of the A theory of time with the B theory of time. What it says is that the events of the past are all real and existent. So Socrates and Thomas Aquinas and Abraham Lincoln, they're all real and existing at their respective times. But the present is sort of the edge of becoming. And the future is unreal, but additional layers get added to this block of the past. And I'm convinced this is incoherent. I've argued this in my book, Time and Eternity. I think it falls prey to what's called McTaggart's paradox. and therefore is not a viable alternative to a pure A theory of time.
Okay, we have a comment. This is more of a comment from David LaRosa. He says, Dr. Craig, I would not have learned about Molinism if it were not for you. Seems a view made to measure for this time in history. Thank you. You make it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled Christian.
Wow, thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. I learned about middle knowledge myself from listening to people like Alvin Plantinga and Thomas Flint, Alfred Freddoso, and it revolutionized my theology and my understanding of God and of Christianity.
Okay, question from Stefan Holm. Today I was reading 1 Peter. I was confused of passages that seem to indicate that some people are already predestined to damnation. For example, 1 Peter 2:8. What is your position on predestination?
I think that predestination is based upon God's middle knowledge in that he knows who will freely accept his grace and be saved. Or let me rephrase it. He knows who would freely accept his grace and be saved were he to create them in certain circumstances. And so by creating various people in various circumstances, he knows who will come to faith and who will not. And so in virtue of God's choosing to create that world, they are in a sense predestined. That is to say, their eternal destiny is set, but it's one that they themselves determine by their own free choices. So look at my work on middle knowledge, like my book, The Only Wise God, which goes into this in some detail.
Okay, question from Saved Skeptic. I've seen convincing geological evidence from organizations like Is Genesis History that points to a recent flood. Have you seen the evidence and do you find it compelling?
I think that flood geology is absolutely hopeless. Take a look at Hugh Ross's book, Navigating Genesis. Hugh is an old earth creationist who's very much in dialogue with young earth creationists. And his chapters on the scientific evidence concerning the flood are just absolutely crushing. There's simply no way that there was a worldwide flood that wiped out all terrestrial life on Earth other than those aboard the ark.
Okay, we're just going to keep chugging along. So Io asks, I'm confused how a nominalistic deflationary theory of truth works when propositions don't objectively exist outside of the framework to show truth.
Well, I wonder if he's read my article in Philosophia Christi on propositional truth, who needs it? And what I point out there is that the truth predicate really is not a substantial property of propositions. It's merely a device of what's called a semantic assent. That is to say, rather than making an assertion, we can make an assertion about the assertion. Rather than say, for example, World War II began on September 1st, 1939, we can ascend semantically and say, it's true that World War II began on September 1st, 1939. But we can always descend semantically, and rather than asserting that something is true, we can just make the assertion. So the truth predicate is really good for what are called blind truth ascriptions, where we don't know the content of the assertion. For example, I can say, everything in the classified documents is true. And I don't know what's in the classified documents, so I can't just assert them, but I can use this truth ascription with regard to what's in the classified documents. So for someone like God, who does know all truth, or can make any assertions, he doesn't even need this device of blind truth ascriptions. He can get along quite handily without truth at all. So I don't think that we need propositional truth. It's just a handy device for ignorant persons like ourselves who need to make blind truth ascriptions.
Okay, so unfortunately, we've got about 15 minutes left, and what I'm going to do at this point is scroll through and find the people who have sent in a whole lot of money. And so I really apologize. We're not going to be able. We're not going to be able to get to every question today, unfortunately. But here's a question from Joseph Tatum. It's not a question; it's a comment. He says, "I don't really have a question. I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Craig for helping me to find Jesus. It has turned my life around and would not have happened without you. I'm emotional just sending this."
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for your gift to capturing Christianity as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's been incredible, the amount of super chats and comments that people have been sending in. We've got to do this again.
I'm so encouraged about Brittany's coming on board with you and being your partner in capturing Christianity. I think that's a wonderful vision for a married couple.
It is. It's such a blessing, and it probably wouldn't have been possible just a few months ago. It's incredible how all of this is coming together. God is good. All right. Dewabble Fett this is his question. Regarding Graham Oppy's take on the application of math, intuitively it seems like statements like 1 is greater than 0 are necessary. For example, one God is greater than none. So why is that a radical position to take?
Because what is at issue here is not the truth of arithmetical statements. What is at issue here is the physical descriptions of the physical phenomena in mathematical equations, like the 10 equations for the gravitational field and the general theory of relativity, or the equations of quantum mechanics. Those are not necessary truths. Those are mathematical descriptions of physical phenomena that could well have been false. As I said earlier, we could have lived in a Newtonian universe that was described by quite different equations. So the issue is not the necessary truth of mathematical or arithmetical statements. I agree that they're necessarily true. The question is, why are the physical phenomena describable by these elegant mathematical laws?
Okay, here's a comment or question. This is actually a question from the Bible Dingers podcast. By the way, I was interviewed by them, and it was a great interview. If there isn't freedom to sin in heaven, as you mentioned, how did Satan and demons rebel and sin? Love you, Dr. Craig. You're pretty cool too, Cam. Talking to me.
Well, obviously what I've said would require that when God created the angels, he also created them at a sort of epistemic distance, a kind of arm's length that would permit them to choose irrevocably for or against God. And so there was an angelic fall, which I take to be the origin of Satan and the demons. And then those angels who chose for God were sealed in their decision in the same way that I think our decision will be sealed in heaven by a fuller vision of God than they had before.
All right, so for these last few questions that we're going to ask, I'm going to just try to pick them at random. So this is the most recent question that was sent in from Cowboy 1000. What is the best book on the defense of the resurrection?
Dale Allison's book, Resurrecting Jesus. Now, I want to warn you, Allison is very even-handed. I've never seen the negative case presented more powerfully against the resurrection than Allison. But he overcomes it, and in the end, opts for the historicity of the burial narrative, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the origin of the disciples' belief, and Jesus' resurrection. And it's precisely because the negative case is presented so strongly that his case for the resurrection of Jesus is all the more powerful.
Okay, question from Steve Hall. Regarding Psalms 82, does the divine council still exist?
I don't know. How could I know the answer to that question? I guess I just say, why not?
Okay, question from Carmel Crunk. What do you think about atheists leaving the faith due to the evidence of evolution?
Oh, I think he means leaving the Christian faith. I think that's wholly unnecessary. Once you give up the idea that the world was created in 6 consecutive 24-hour days, then Genesis doesn't say anything about how God created the biosphere. Indeed, there are suggestions in the narrative itself that the earth itself participated in the creation. It says he didn't just create the vegetation and the animals. He said, let the earth bring forth these things. And it was so. The earth brought forth these plants and animals. So I just don't have any problem theologically at all with the theory of evolution.
Okay, this one is from Damascus TV. He says, quick question. Thank you for your work, Dr. Craig. I'm one of the translators of Korean version of On Guard. Do you have a plan to visit my country someday?
Only if I'm invited. I would love to come to Korea, but people need to understand that we don't set up our own speaking engagements. We merely respond to invitations by local groups who are willing to organize, publicize, finance the event, and then I'll come if we think it is a strategic event.
All right, Garrett Essery says, my friend says that Molinism is a less direct version of Calvinism. How do I respond?
Tell him that the critical distinction is that Molinism affirms libertarian free will, whereas Calvinism doesn't. And that's the deciding difference between the two.
All right, Slidge-Fredo. If the cosmological argument true in everything that begins is true in that everything that begins to exist has a cause, does Molinism refute this, that personal agents have free will exclusive to God's omniscience, restricted by natural propositions?
No, the first premise is very carefully formulated. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, or everything that begins to exist has a cause. I'm talking about substances that come into being. It is fully consistent with saying that there are uncaused events that happen without a cause. That's why quantum indeterminacy is not a refutation of the first premise, nor are choices of freedom, free choices of the will, exceptions to the first premise. It's quite consistent with uncaused events happening.
Okay, question from Joseph Aggs. Dr. Craig, I am currently taking a class that involves several Bart Ehrman works. Is there one tip you have about engaging with his material to come out more confident?
I would wonder if Joseph has seen my YouTube videos responding to Bart Ehrman. I would really encourage him to look on YouTube. It's these videos I gave at Grace Point Church. I'm wearing a bright orange polo shirt. That's how you'll recognize them. And I give I think, a very powerful critique of Ehrman's views. He might also look at the YouTube video of my debate with Bart Ehrman, in which I show that Ehrman's objections to the resurrection are just recapitulations, warmed over versions of Hume's argument against the identification of a miracle.
Okay, question from Cool Blaze. Let me populate it on the screen here. John Loftus, one of your former pupils, came to a book club of mine and was quite a character. Do you have any thoughts on his work?
Only that I think it's tragic. John was one of my best students at Trinity. He had a bright future, and he, as a young pastor, fell into pornography and an illicit extramarital affair, and it derouted his faith. And it's just a tragedy, just a crying shame. And I so regret what happened to John.
Okay, question from Adam Sharp. How do you respond to Richard Swinburne that moral propositions, if true, are necessarily true, and so are not evidence for theism? They would have to be true even on atheism. Thanks for everything you do.
Robert Adams gives a great response to Swinburne on this. In his book, Finite and Infinite Goods. What Robert Adams points out is that necessary propositions can still have explanations. And that, by the way, is why Graham Oppy is wrong, too. Even if the mathematical equations are necessarily true, that doesn't mean that they don't have explanations. There can be necessary truths that are explanatorily prior to other necessary truths. For example, it's explanatorily true that it's necessarily true that states of consciousness exist. Why? Well, because God exists. God's existence is explanatorily prior to the proposition that states of consciousness exist. And it's clearly an asymmetric dependence. No one would say that God exists because states of consciousness exist. Or again, arithmetic truths like 2 plus 2 equals 4 are true because the axioms of Peano arithmetic are true. And so these arithmetic truths follow as theorems from the axioms, even though they're all necessarily true. So there can be relations of explanatory priority among necessary truths. And that's why there can be necessary truths of morality that are explained by God.
I think one way of maybe saying that is that some necessary truths are still dependent on something else in order to be true.
Yes, that would be one way. Or to say that not every necessary truth is a brute truth. There are necessary truths that are explainable.
All right, maybe a couple more questions. All right, from For Liberty, For Justice, For All. Dr. Craig, you seem to not believe the story of Noah is literal, and I assume the same for Jonah and others. How are we to discern real versus not?
I wouldn't say that about Jonah. I haven't studied Jonah. The reason I say this about Noah is because of my analysis of the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11. Let me compare the book of Revelation. Nobody that I know of takes the book of Revelation literally. Nobody thinks there's going to be a red dragon whose tail is going to sweep 1/3 of the stars from the sky, or that a big monster is going to crawl out of the sea and take over the world. Everyone knows that this is Jewish apocalyptic literature that is filled with symbolic characters that represent things like national states and alliances. Well, just as the Bible ends with this symbolic, non-literal apocalyptic literature, it begins with the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which I would class as belonging to the genre of mytho-history. That is to say, it's not intended to be literalistic history. It is historical events clothed with the figurative imagery and metaphor of mythology. And so that's why I would not construe stories about Noah and the ark literally, even though they may be rooted in an actual historical flood event.
What would you say to someone that says that you're only holding that view because you want to make your beliefs about Christianity consistent with science?
Yeah, that's called Congruism, and that certainly is a great temptation. I would be disingenuous to deny that, Cameron. I mean, obviously, I want the Bible to be consistent with what we know about modern science. And so it would be disingenuous for me to say that plays no role. But I honestly tried to approach this hermeneutical interpretation of Genesis as objectively as I could. And I became convinced by Old Testament scholar Bill Arnold, on the basis of the etiological motifs in Genesis 1 to 11, that this literature does belong to the genre of mythology. Etiology is the attempt to ground realities present to the author in events in the prehistoric past. And Genesis 1 to 11 is just shot through with these etiological motifs. And so I'm convinced that a good case can be made for this genre of literature in Genesis 1 to 11, quite independently of scientific concordism. And that's why in my book on the historical atom, by the way, the biblical material comes first, and then only later comes the scientific material. It's the reverse order of Dennis Veneman and Scott McKnight's book, where you have first the science, and then you have the Bible adjusted to try to meet the science. My order is precisely the opposite. I begin with the biblical text, which I take to be inspired of God and therefore authoritative. And then only after hermeneutically exegeting it, then I do the scientific study.
All right, let's do one more question. And all right, here it is from Fred H. Thanks for your awesome work, Dr. Craig. What is your view on women's role in the church?
I accept what Paul says, that women should not have a teaching role in the church, and that therefore women should not be elders in the church. They can be in the deaconate, they can be deaconesses, and they could be the head of the women's ministry, they could be involved in Sunday school, teaching children, and so forth. But I would not have a woman be in the pastoral role as the senior pastor, where she would be teaching men Christian doctrine, nor would I have a woman teaching a Sunday school class where she is teaching Christian doctrine to men. I think that the role for men to play in the local church is as the teachers of Christian doctrine.
Do you have time for maybe one more question?
Yes.
Okay, here it is from David Swander, and he just sent this in. When Jesus became God in the flesh, what were his limitations? He didn't lose his deity, but he still seemed in distress and needed to pray. What were his limits, if any?
Okay, I want to recommend to David that he read my chapter on the Incarnation in the book Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. And in that, I lay out a theory of the Incarnation in which Christ is fully divine. He doesn't surrender any of his divine attributes. He is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, fully divine. But he has a human nature which is limited spatially, temporally, cognitively, biologically, and therefore has a human consciousness which is like any ordinary first century Jewish person, but it is undergirded by a divine subliminal, which is the Logos. And this relates to the question that we opened with today about dreams and being yourself in a dream that you are yourself dreaming, and connects very closely with this model of the Incarnation that I offer and defend.
Okay, one last comment. This is not a question, it's just a comment from Drew. He says, Dr. Craig, thank you for spending the time with CAM as it's necessary to mentor the next generation of thinking Christians in helping us continue to defend the faith after our Father calls you home. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. It's a burden that I do share. Yes.
All right, with that, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Craig. It's been awesome, and I don't want to say I was surprised at how quickly we were able to power through so many questions in such a short amount of time. It was actually kind of long. An hour and a half is a good deal of time, but it seemed like it wasn't that long. So anyways, thank you. It went by so quick. Thank you so much.
Cameron, and I look forward to the next time that I can be on with you.
Awesome. Great. And we'll see you guys later. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. And yep, see ya.